Welcome to the Land Matters podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Well, so far, 2023 has been a scorcher with record-breaking extreme heat from the U.S. Southwest to the Middle East and beyond. Overall, planet Earth saw its hottest days on record in July. Extreme weather and torrential rains, meanwhile, swelled rivers and made roads buckle in the Northeast of the United States. And of course, the wildfires. Stubborn fires in Greece recently have forced thousands to flee, and huge expanses of Canadian forests continue to be ablaze. Those fires, of course, prompting the phenomenon of hazy, acrid smoke hanging over big swaths of North America from Chicago to Boston. An apocalyptic scene that brought the reality of wildfires much closer to home for so many more people. Well, climate change is having a significant impact on wildfires around the world. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, climate change, including increased heat, extended drought, what they call a thirsty atmosphere, it's all been key drivers in increasing the risk and extent of wildfires in the western United States during the last 2 decades. NOAA says big wildfires require the alignment of a number of factors, including temperature, humidity, and the lack of moisture in fuels such as trees, shrubs, grasses, and forest debris, and that all of these factors have a strong direct or indirect tie to climate variability and climate change. Well, today we're joined by someone who can explain what's going on with today's wildfires and what the stewards of the planet, that is ultimately all of us, can possibly do about it. Ed Struzik is author of Firestorm, How Wildlife Will Shape Our Future, recently published by Island Press, and also Dark Days at Noon, The Future of Fire. He's been writing about scientific and environmental issues for more than 30 years, a fellow at the Institute of Energy and Environmental Policy at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. He's done the Atkinson Fellowship in Public Policy and the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship, spending a year at Harvard and MIT. He was researching environment, evolutionary biology, and politics with E.O. Wilson and Stephen Jay Gould, among others. He's a regular contributor to Yale Environment 360, covering topics such as the effects of climate change and fossil fuel extraction on northern ecosystems and their inhabitants. He's on the board of directors for the Canadian Arctic Resources Committee. That's a citizens organization dedicated to the long-term environmental and social well-being of northern Canada and its peoples. And he lives in Edmonton, Alberta. Edward Struzik, welcome to Land Matters.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, I'd like to start off by establishing a baseline here, or some sense, given the last couple of 100 years in North America. Are wildfires really now today bigger, more intense, and long-lasting, and more destructive? Is that correct? That's not our imagination, right?
Well, it is and it isn't. And I'll explain it by looking at a parallel situation we had from around 1850, 1870 to around 1910. And if you read the newspaper reports, New York Times, Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, and other Western papers at the time, there was a lot of fire burning on the landscape at that time. And I was puzzled by this, reading these excerpts from the newspapers and just astonished to see how fires would, overrun oil rigs in Pennsylvania and burn the toe of Michigan. It's actually how the American Red Cross came to be, was that they came to the rescue of all those people that were driven out of their homes. And the Red Cross essentially was established at that time. And what I realized was going on was that it was really a matter of poor or lack of land management. We had a lot more forest back then, obviously, because we didn't have a lot of the urban centers that we have now. But we also had farmers, that were coming out and burning and slashing to create their farmland. And a lot of these fires got out of control and spread into the adjoining forest. We also had timber companies that would also burn their slash indiscriminately and let them get away with that. Remember, as well as we did not have firefighters back then, so there was no team that could come in and deal with these fires. We also had mining companies that were buying up forests, and not to harvest the timber so much as to burn the forest so that they could actually get what was beneath the ground. And this was a policy that extended right from the east to the Rockies. And so we had a lot of human-caused fire back then that created a lot of devastation, a lot of deaths. The Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin killed more people than any fire in North American history. The Miramichi fire in Maine and New Brunswick, Canada, remains the largest fire recorded in North American history. That was in 1825. So we had a lot of fire back then. The other reason why we had so much fire at that time is that the British and the Europeans came over at a time when we were just emerging from what was called the Little Ice Age. It was a cold period from around 1250 to around 1825, 1850. It was much colder, much wetter. And so fires didn't loom large, when the settlers first came to Virginia. But then it started warming up. And as it warmed up, and as these farmers and miners and lumbermen were clearing the land indiscriminately by burning it, essentially, it just created a situation which was ripe for wildfire. The difference between then and now is we're the ones who are creating the temperature increase. We're the ones that are warming the climate. And I think that we are now heading into uncharted territory. I don't know that anybody would argue that we're entering a new paradigm that is really quite frightening. One of the other things that would have triggered fires was lightning. So in the Little Ice Age, you probably had very little lightning triggering fires, just simply because it was too cold and wet for these big thunderstorms that come through. And even if they did trigger a fire, the landscape was so wet that they wouldn't spread long distances. In fact, I think there are parts of Maine and Massachusetts where there's really no evidence of fire during that period of time. So things started warming up. Firefighters know this equation. So for every 1 degree increase in temperature, you have about 12% more lightning. So back then, as things warmed up, you'd have more lightning. And right now, we're seeing this happen with 1-2 degree increases, and especially this year where we're having a lot of lightning. And it's starting to migrate northward. So it's not just simply a sort of a mid-latitude phenomena where you're getting thunderstorms. You're getting thunderstorms near the North Pole nowadays because of the amount of heat that's being generated there, and the fact there's so much open water, and that water is warming, and that vapor rises, and when it hits cold air, bang, you get a thunderstorm, and then you get some lightning.
And you can get apparently this phenomenon of dry lightning, that is lightning without rain.
That's very common, especially right across the West. We're obviously really right now in the midst of a 20, 30-year drought, with the exception of last winter. You have a low pressure system coming through, creating lightning, but not rain. What we're also seeing is pyro-CBs, which are energy-driven thunderstorms caused by wildfire. So wildfire can actually create its own thunderstorm because of the amount of heat and vapor, that it sucks up from all the vegetation and the wetlands that it may be burning through, and it rises up just like what would happen normally in a thunderstorm. And you get what they call a dirty thunderstorm that almost never produces any rain, but shoots out lightning. A great example of this was the Fort McMurray fire in the oil sands of northern Alberta in 2016, where it was blue sky days, and the fires there created their own thunderstorm and shot out lightning 20 miles in advance of the fire front. So that's how much energy there was, and created a cluster of fires 20 miles away from the front of the fire. And of course, firefighters at that time were thinking, how do you manage this? They have their forecasting scenarios, but when you have a thunderstorm created by a wildfire and it's shooting out lightning 20 miles away, you've got a new rule book coming into play, and everybody's adjusting to this. And also, I think that the other big thing for them is that you can no longer put people on the ground or in the air in a situation like that, because it's essentially like a small to moderate sized volcano that's blowing up. That's how much energy there is in these pyro-CBs.
Oh my gosh. Well, we want to talk about containment and firefighting strategies in just a bit, but tell us more about what's going on literally on the ground. What happens on the ground? Are the forests drier? And if so, what leads to that? Are there dead trees? Is it the debris on the forest floor? Can you walk us through what's happening to spark these fires?
Let's go back in time to the 1870s to the present period. The other thing that we did as land managers, or mismanagers, I would say, was that we drained an awful lot of wetland. In fact, an area bigger than the size of California for agricultural purposes, for mosquito control, for mining, for urban development. And if you think about it, a firefighter's best friend really is a wetland, a swamp, a bog, a fen, a marsh. And as any firefighter will tell you, if you got a hot, windy day and you got a fire that's burning more than, say, 100,000 acres or even 50,000 acres, there's no way they can stop that fire by traditional means. They can maybe slow it down, steer it away from people who might be in harm's way, but there's no way they're going to be able to put it out. What can put it out is a wetland, because once it hits a wetland, it really doesn't have anything to burn because things are just too wet and moist. And so we've essentially eliminated all of those natural fire barriers over time. And it's bigger than an area the size of California. So fire now basically has its own way once it gets going. The other thing that's happening is that with warming, we're getting a lot more evaporation. So whatever moisture we have in the ground is getting sucked up very, very quickly. As any soil scientist or forestry scientist will tell you, a forest has very little memory of a heavy rainfall after about 10 days of very hot weather. It can rain like crazy, but then if you get 80, 90-degree hot, dry weather, the forest doesn't remember that moisture. It may store it up, but basically things started getting really brittle. And so it's ripe for a fire. And all you need for a fire is either lightning or some human being carelessly starting a fire, which I think, in parts of the United States, that's the biggest problem.
And dead trees, this scenario where, for example, the pine beetle or other insects are moving into new areas, killing trees. And so you got a lot of dead trees. That's just an absolute tinderbox, right? Is that part of it too?
It is. There's a lot of controversy about how much these dead trees contribute to the fire situation, but I think it's probably safe to say that they do. And from a land management point of view, I think the thing that's inescapable is that once those trees die, they're no longer sucking up moisture from the ground. And so it's one reason why you see so much flooding after a wildfire, especially in an area that's infested with dead trees, is that you get a very heavy rainfall, or if you have a big snowpack melting in the springtime, you don't have the trees basically absorbing that moisture. And so it goes straight into a river system. And the scary thing about it, from a public health point of view, an ecological point of view, is that if you think about it, say a fire tears through the mountainsides in Colorado, which has happened a number of times, obviously, and there are no trees to suck up all that moisture, you have all of that ash, all of that carbon on the ground. And the thunderstorm comes in. We are having more extreme thunderstorms for a variety of reasons and record heavy rainfalls in these spots. So it sweeps through and then it just collects all of that carbon and soot, puts it into the river, and actually threatens our drinking water supplies. Denver nearly lost its water treatment plant many years ago as a result of wildfire. Sydney, Australia actually had to build a new water treatment plant because of the fires that burned there in 2003. And there's a great example of this in Waterton Lakes National Park on the Montana border. There's a waterfall that most tourists come to see called Cameron Falls. And a year after the fire, following a thunderstorm, that crystal clear mountain water that descended over the falls turned absolutely black. The contrast was so striking. Fortunately, not a lot of people live in the park and their water supply was not affected. But if you have big cities like Denver, for example, that live downstream, reliant on mountain water, it's becoming a very serious problem. Even lakes in Oregon, those places which are now burning like they've never burned before, are really on high alert because they just don't have treatment systems that are designed to deal with so much carbon.
A couple of folks here at the Lincoln Institute have done some work looking at floods after wildfires, and it just keeps getting more apocalyptic. Let's talk about the smoke and the haze and the darkness and sort of acrid smoke that's settled over northern United States from the Canadian wildfires. having that smoke around really made people, I think, sit up and take notice. But you say that this has happened before in our history where you've had the smoke settle over populated regions.
Yeah, I'll give you two examples. The title of my last book on fire, Dark Days at Noon, The Future of Fire, is based on a real Dark Days at Noon phenomena that occurred in 1780 in the Massachusetts area, where the skies darkened at noontime. And no one at the time, obviously, there were no daily newspapers and there was not a lot of understanding of fire or science. And most people were extremely religious. So when the skies went dark at noon, everybody went to church. And they were great record keepers at that time, especially the ministers at church would write about it. And everybody believed that the end of the world was coming. And in fact, the Massachusetts legislature was sitting at the time, and there was calls for an adjournment. One of the state lawmakers said that no, we have to stand ground. We'll be here to find out what happens. If God decides it, then. So that ended. In fact, George Washington recorded it in his diary when he's out with the army. His wife sent letters. The president of Harvard University at the time came closest to understanding. He thought it might have been smoke from farmers that were burning slash in some other part of the state. But now we know that it was actually a fire likely from Algonquin Provincial Park in Canada that burned in 1780, and that smoke would have drifted down. The other really fascinating example was a fire in 1950 called the Chinchaga Fire, which was, I think, the second biggest fire in North American history. It burned in northern British Columbia and Alberta, and it burned for, I think, 180 days straight. And it created this smoke that drifted into New England and New York State and created the same situations. Many people at the time, if you read the New York Times reports of it, people, again, many of them still very religious, thought it was a sign that the world was going to end. But there were obviously meteorologists at that time that realized it was coming from Canada. But the impact was so profound that the New York Yankees had to turn the lights on for an afternoon baseball game. Utilities in some places, such as Toronto and Ottawa, the power went out because people were turning their lights on in the afternoon. They weren't prepared for the surge of power that was required. A B-52 bomber, I think, went missing. Airplanes were grounded because of the fire, a similar situation that we have today. So it has happened in the past, but, it was episodic. But I think what we're seeing now, obviously from this summer, is that we're going to see more of these pulses of smoke coming from northern Canada into the United States. And hopefully it doesn't create any kind of animosity at our border.
Let's jump ahead to solutions and how to deal with these wildfires. Can you address firefighting techniques given this kind of brand of wildfire and the conditions on the ground? We see it on the evening news. It all looks so intractable and perilous. What's the latest state of the art for trying to contain or manage these fires?
Well, I think we're using 20th century strategies to deal with a 21st era paradigm, which we're not prepared for. We still have an extraordinary number of volunteer firefighters that are relied upon to deal with these fires. We still have firefighting forces that are on contract rather than permanent. So they come and go because they want a year-round job. And so as a result, we're reliant more and more on other countries. The United States comes to the rescue when we're in trouble. Canada comes to the rescue when the United States is in trouble. And now here in Canada, we have, I think 2,000 firefighters from all over the world: South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico. The fact is that, as I mentioned before, there's not a lot you can do once a fire reaches a certain size and you have hot, windy weather. You can slow that fire maybe, you can steer it out of harm's way. So I think, we've got to start thinking about other strategies. We've got to invest a lot more in science and predicting where these fires are likely to start. Also, better understanding the landscape. Where are the refugia from fires? Those areas that are unlikely to burn, or those areas that will slow or stop a fire. And maybe we should start looking at those areas from a conservation point of view, is protect those areas so that we don't lose these natural barriers. Another thing that we can do is restore many of those wetlands that we have drained over the years. And, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is doing this in many places in the United States, not just for fire control, but also for flood control. When you think about it, a restored wetland is very, very good at absorbing all the moisture that comes from rain. You have mosses like sphagnum that absorb 26% of their weight in moisture. It's like a big sponge. And if you got a lot of sphagnum in a wetland, you can have a torrential rainfall. And basically, the sphagnum sucks it all up, and then it grows and spreads and creates even a bigger buffer for flood and for wildfire. And it's relatively cheap to do. You don't have to do a lot of engineering to restore a wetland, because essentially wetlands are naturally created where water wants to go. And what we've done is that we've pumped out so much water, and we continue to pump out so much water in those areas. So let's just shut off the pumps, let nature bring back that water over time, or pipe in some of that water. The sphagnum will be happy. The ducks and the water birds will be happy. Maybe we'll have a few mosquitoes, but I think I would take more mosquitoes than I would breathing in, acrid smoke every day.
What of this debate we've all been hearing over many years about controlled burns or land management that has resulted in denser forests? Can you just touch on those different schools of thought about humankind trying to intervene and do these controlled burns? What's that all about?
It goes back to 1910 when Congress enacted legislation to essentially set up the U.S. Forest Service as a firefighting agency and to suppress fires as much as possible. I mean, we had parachute jumpers, we had fire lookouts. We essentially launched an army. I mean, Roosevelt's army during the Depression years, one of their biggest tasks was to fight fires and also to create a firefighting force. So we suppressed fires very, very well for about 80, 90 years, but then it caught up on us, because what people don't understand is that many of the forests in North America are fire dependent. These spruce or pine cones that are holding the seeds, and really there's only the warmth, the heat of a fire that can actually open up those cones. You need a fire. If I look out my front door here, I have 6 white spruce trees that are probably 80 to 100 years old. They're lovely, but they're artifacts. They're waiting to die. And as an indigenous person I know had a look at it, he was pointing to the boughs, that have got so heavy that are touching the ground. And he said, in all culture, that means it's time to burn. The tree is telling fire, come and get me, so that those boughs on the ground will come and it'll light up and spread the cones, clear the land, open it up for root vegetables to grow, for berries to grow, and for wildlife such as grizzly bears and black bears that come in and feed on those root vegetables and berries. And so, it's a natural phenomenon that we have. We understood that this was necessary. The U.S. Forest Service did before the turn of the last century, and started doing some controlled burns and allowing fires to burn on their own in the backcountry. Of course, the problem, though, is that sometimes it backfires. Yellowstone was a great example, the fire of 1988 in Yellowstone, or 87, which caught the attention of the world. It hit the front page of the Los Angeles Times 50, 60 times that summer. And it was a result of a let burn policy in Yellowstone that nearly got the superintendent fired. And controlled burns also had that same kind of history. As the Cerro Grande fire in New Mexico in 2000 was a controlled burn that got out of control and overran the Los Alamos nuclear laboratory, destroyed 400 homes and most of the structures at Los Alamos, unfortunately, not the nuclear material that was stored there. And so we've had these, which has kind of set back the programs incrementally, episodically. We've now got to the stage where it's getting so hot, so dry, and so windy that the risks are rising. We also have so many people who are in harm's way. We've just populated the landscape to the point where controlled burns are very difficult from a political point of view. Politicians don't want to embrace it because, it could mean that they don't win an election. We also have that situation where something is likely to go wrong. But the other examples is that it creates the resiliency. There was an indigenous community in British Columbia that decided to do some controlled burning and thinning on their reserve. They did it on their own because they own the land. Once it ended, a fire tore through the area and they lost only one building. And the postmortem after that was they would have lost basically everything had they not done it. So we're being faced with some really difficult choices, and prescribed burning, controlled burning is certainly one of them, but it doesn't apply to every forest or every vegetation, like the chaparral country in California. It's pretty good indications that that's not the way to go. But for most of the forests in North America, there's a role to be played there.
So can good things happen after these big wildfires we've been seeing recently? Forest burning is part of the natural process. Are good things happening with these big wildfires now?
It depends on your point of view. If you own an acreage or, log cabin in the forest and that's your dream home, it's not good news. But for many areas, and I'll give you an example, I was involved in a grizzly bear study in Jasper National Park in Canada over a long period of time. I was documenting what was going on. And one of the things they didn't understand was that the bears that were being captured, weighed, and measured for health and size seemed to be much smaller inside the park than outside the park in fragmented areas where there was a lot of burning. There was also logging going on. Then the eureka moment came was that when they really did a kind of vegetation analysis, there was a lot more for those bears outside the park to eat because the fire had cleared the land, created the conditions for root vegetables to grow. Mushrooms are a great example. Mushrooms on the forest floor reset. And what you have here, I always laugh about this, is that in Canada, there's what's called a kind of a Russian mafia. Russians, like Europeans, are really fixated on mushrooms, morel mushrooms. You can make a fortune collecting them and selling them. Everybody who knows anything about mushrooms knows that morels rise up wonderfully after a wildfire.
After a fire, yeah.
So a lot of really good things happen. But also, on the other hand, is we're also starting to see fires that are burning so intensely, so hot, that they're literally burning deep into the duff, and they're destroying all the seeds that might be stored there and all of the nutrients that might allow for a forest to regenerate. And I think that's the scary example. We've seen some of these examples in Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada, where it's essentially created as desert-like landscape. The conditions just aren't right there for pine trees to come back.
I want to pause for a moment and talk just a little bit more about mushrooms. Apparently, they're both a factor in forest floor fuel. And as I understand it, the incinerated fungi actually gets into the smoke that people are breathing, which is pretty crazy as well. But then I also saw some research that suggests that mushrooms can help prevent megafires. Can you just talk about fires and fungi for a bit?
Well, I think, it goes back to what I said about wetlands, is that fungi love moisture. They need moisture to thrive. And so any forest floor that is moist, that is suitable for fungi to grow, you have kind of more of a holistic situation. And it's kind of like trees that have a lot of moisture. Ponderosa pine, there's a wonderful example, can hold moisture for a long period of time. It's an iconic tree in Montana that has a very thick bark, and a fire can tear through there and literally cut into half of the trunk of the tree, and it still will survive. And so, we've seen this evolution take place. The forest is filled with fire resilient species that not only can survive a fire, but actually do well after a fire. I think this is something that we need to better understand and appreciate, and are planning for how we can shape the landscape to become more resilient to fire. And going back to this idea of putting more firefighters on the ground or in the air is a necessary part of it, but it's certainly not the solution. I think there's just a lot more we can do to make our landscape more resilient.
These impacts of climate change, they're up in our face now. But it seems like you've got two things here. One is the triage, a little bit similar to making a shoreline more resilient, right? Taking near-term action, trying to limit the destruction, save lives, of course, and property. But let's wrap up our fantastic conversation here and think about the longer term. You've already suggested a holistic approach to land and forest management, but what would you advise that society should do? It sure seems like this is perhaps the greatest, potentially, of all teachable moments.
I think we have to accept the fact that we've got to have to learn to live with wildfire and the smoke that comes from wildfire. This isn't going to go away unless we have another little ice age suddenly cool things off dramatically. So there's a number of different ways that we can handle it. Like I said, we can do more prescribed burning where it's appropriate. We can restore our wetlands, which would create natural buffers on the landscape. We can invest in science that provide firefighters with better tools in predicting where fire is likely to burn, so they can have resources there on the ground to deal with it before it gets totally out of control. And I think in urban centers, we've got to understand that when you have that thick, acrid smoke in places, especially, Chicago, Texas, where, it's extremely hot, and you have this combination of heat and smoke, both of which are potentially fatal. We have to, I think, also understand that we've got to do something to make us more resilient. And what I've been advocating quite simply is that we have an awful lot of schools right across the country that are empty during the fire season because kids aren't going there. Why not just retrofit these schools with air purifiers in small towns and big towns? And so these are places where people can go, during the day. It's one of a number of things, that strike me as obvious, but we really haven't capitalized on. It's similar to, we've spent an awful lot of money buying out people who built land on floodplains, and we've allowed many to continue to stay there for ridiculous purposes. I just think there's so much that we can do to make ourselves more resilient to fire, to learn to live with fire, and it's not all that complicated. We really just have to accept the fact this is not going to go away. We need to come up with some solutions. Say somebody retired from the U.S. Forest Service or a university scientist to come in and tell them how you can become more resilient to fire. Is it thinning? Is it prescribed burning? Is it retrofitting your buildings? Do you stay and defend in situations, as many Americans are doing, just to get some expert advice to those communities that are extremely vulnerable to fire? And especially, I think it's not just communities, but, ranchers and farmers are increasingly being threatened by fire. And many of them stay and defend because they've got livestock to deal with. They don't want their cattle and their horses and their sheep to get destroyed by fire. And so they essentially put themselves in harm's way. And they also, take away firefighting resources because firefighters can't let these people get burned because that will be the end of their careers. So we have to make them more resilient. And if I can just, on a final note, where it's done really elegantly, I should say, was in Willow, Alaska, which is in the boreal forest and very fire-prone region. It has more sled dogs than people. And those sled dogs owners decided at one point that fire's going to come to their town and not only destroy their property, but destroy their dogs. So they created this system, radio communication in case the telephones, went out, the cell phones went out. They had muster points where people could go. They had food stored for the dogs on those muster points. They had a system in place where if someone was vulnerable, they would come in with trailers, move the animals out of there, so that if the next fire burned, they would all have a safe place to go and let the firefighters do what they needed to do. Simple. They empowered themselves. And I think if the fire does come, I think they're going to do extremely well.
Well, Ed Struzik, thank you for talking about wildfires here on Land Matters.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone for tuning in. If you want more information about climate impacts and land use and all the options for climate action and building resilience, check out the Lincoln Institute website, lincolninst.edu. Click on Our Work, and you'll see our prominent goal of promoting low-carbon, climate-resilient communities and regions. And follow us on Twitter. The handle is easy to remember. It's @LandPolicy. And that is it for this episode of Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We hope you'll rate, share, and subscribe to Land Matters so you never miss a show. And so until next time, I'm your host, Anthony Flint. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, everybody.